What does nobody understand about the current financial system? Well, Justin's going to kind of walk us through an accounting framework how liabilities or how loans in the current financial system, and that's key, the current way that the financial system works, and we'll get into that in just a moment, are actually contra liabilities. So, Justin, first explain what a contra liability is, and then kind of dig down into how those are actually liabilities on a
Gotcha.
bank's balance sheet or philosophical bank's balance sheet.
This is much more from like the philosophical standpoint of accounting rather than the actual metrics, although I think there's a tie-in. So everybody knows for every debit, you have to have a credit. That's why it's called a balance sheet, and that's why it has to be in balance. And typically, not always though, but typically what this means is that if you create an asset on one side of the balance sheet, you have to have a corresponding liability on the other side of the balance sheet to match up. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be true. Josh, here's a good example. Let's say that you have $500,000 and you buy a home for, or back up, don't use real estate. Let's say you have $500,000 and you buy $100,000 worth of, short-term, treasury bills or whatever, right? Well, you've stayed on the asset side of the balance sheet. You haven't actually done anything on your liabilities. Why do I say that? Because you had $500,000 of assets, and of that $500,000 of assets, you changed 100,000 into of cash into your $100,000 of treasuries. So you actually haven't touched the liability side or the credit side of the balance sheet. You've just solely stayed on the asset side, but you're still in balance. And more importantly, your debit has a credit associated with it. In this case, you debited treasury bills, you credited cash because that's how it would work. Now, my argument is that I've got some graphics to throw up here in just a second. Is that if you go up a level and think about how accounting works, generally the left side, that is the camera backwards, the left side of the balance sheet is what deals with real world stuff. And the right side of the balance sheet is what deals with in the mind or the financial world or what we create. And again, for everything that we create in our mind, you want to have a corresponding thing to the real world. And ultimately, this is going to get into what constrains the commercial banking system and why I'm kind of saying philosophically, I don't think we're treating it the same way and why we're having such a hard time to articulate, myself included, what's going on here. Anyways, Josh, let me see if I can do some on the fly things.
Yes. So while he's doing that, let me just kind of reiterate what he's saying. Right now, if you take out a loan, or if you on the non-bank entities, which is anyone that's not a bank, if I take out if I have $1 billion and I transfer that $1 billion into, let's say, 500 million worth of stocks, 500 million worth of bonds, my asset side, nothing has changed. I still have $1 billion worth of assets, but it has changed in the kind of accounting framework. So Justin,
Yeah.
let's walk us through.
Yeah, so you've jumped from an asset to an asset. And so, oh, sorry, Josh, I'll let you do the driving here. Okay. Yeah, Josh, you've got to do the driving because I'm going to be focusing on this thing over here. So as I said before, let's just start off with things in the real world. And the way we define something that's real, and I'll steal a definition, I think Mike Maloney said this, although I can't remember if it was him or not who first said it. Let's take gold. Just run with me here. And when I say gold, it's because it is no one else's liability. When you actually hold an ounce of gold, or if you have, a coin or whatever in your hand, like this is silver, this is a thing in of itself. It's not a promise by anyone. It is it. Okay, so let's just say that is the only thing philosophically for this exercise that can go on the asset side of the balance sheet. Okay, and so the way I mention this is that you can have a scarce item like gold, like oil or whatever. You could also think of this as collateral in a sense too, but the key thing is that it's no one's, or it could be something as stupid as like cow dung or, those rocks from that island or the islands or whatever, right? But the point is it's something in the real world or whatever. That's the key thing. So that deals with the asset side of the balance sheet. But you also have what I call the imaginary, the intangible side of the balance sheet. So this would be like the liability and the owner's equity side or whatever, right? And the key thing is that there's also this divide, because when you have the real world out there and then you have the imaginary world in here, you've got to have some mechanism to link these things together, or to provide constraint in a sense of what goes on. And this is where you kind of get, the entries of the balance sheet. So what I did for this is that you can think of our approximation of, let's say, paper gold, or, a futures contract for, whatever commodity, as being an approximation of that scarce item. But the key thing is this, is that if you say that you have, 100 ounces of gold as a bank or whatever, right, or, barrels of oil deliverable or whatever, you're actually able to back it up. There's balance between the real world and the intangible world. Okay, you're with me, right? So to show it like this, The real is in balance with the intangible. Right, Josh? You with me? Okay, good. So this is what gives us the concept of the
So
balance
that
sheet.
would just put some, that would be like a full reserve banking where you're backing it 1 to 1 by gold, or in the futures market, if you're buying barrels of oil, then you actually take delivery of that oil. That is going into the financial market and actually getting the physical product with it. So
Yeah.
keep going.
And you could also say there's an argument for fractional reserve in this front, but the point is, even when you do fractional reserve, that component of risk is now embedded in it. And like I said, but that's maybe a separate topic of conversation. So I'm being really simple by keeping everything as full reserve, although we can get into the
Yeah,
weeds there.
even fractional. A lot of people, before you go to that, a lot of people think
Yeah.
that we're on a fractional reserve system. That is far from the truth. Right now, we're on a no reserve system. So then you kind of
Yeah.
ask, well,
Yeah.
what restrains the banking system under that circumstance? And the answer is, at a very, very high level, without going into the extreme inertia, we will in a little bit, is it's just confidence between other banks. There's no sort of restraint. No bank reserve,
Exactly.
treasuries.
Exactly.
There's not a single product that restrains the banking system. And the reason why this is a humongous problem is, what prevents a bank from doing any of this massive financial engineering? In fact, it is nothing, because they have no restraint to the real world. There's
Yeah.
no divide, where Justin was just drawing, between that imaginary line of the financial realm and the real world of commodities, of goods and services. There's no difference.
Yeah, and the other thing too, Josh, we'll get to this in a second, is it also implies that you're out of balance, or there is a very good chance we were out of balance right now. But anyways, I'll get to that in just a second. But anyways, my point is that you have the balance, and this is basically what gives us the balance sheet. So these are the T accounts. Like Gaiman's whiteboard video earlier today, his live stream, did an excellent example of walking this through. And even though I was trained as an accountant myself, I hated doing this stuff in school. But like I also learned, like, this is the stuff like that taught me how to do, like, it's like good form at the gym. This is good form for accounting, whatever, right? Anyways, so let me kind of like show visually what I'm talking about here. So again, key thing right here is that on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, in that orange box, it's assets and real-world things. So these are things that by definition cannot be someone else's liability, okay? It could be whatever you want it to be. It just can't be someone else's liability. It can't be a product of the mind. It has to be something that's real, okay? And on the other side of the balance sheet, the liability side, I call it imaginary things. So it would be our representation of the assets, or our representation of things that are due to us, or our representation of things that are owed to other people, okay? Again, not from the balance sheet of a commercial bank, not from the balance sheet of, a central, but just like philosophically is my
Because
point.
he's talking about real wealth right now, and real wealth is
Yeah.
the goods and services. And there's a massive divide right now between the banking system and what goes on in there, and Main Street, which is producing wealth, which is the goods and services that we are able to consume.
Yeah, you could see that, like, this is like God's balance sheet, and I should say like that. This would be the balance sheet from God's perspective, where he's like, okay, listen, do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you have to have a reconciliation between the real world that actually exists and the world of how we create it. The financialized world, the imaginary world. I mean, all these things go same and same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. I'm actually going to change this just a little bit, and so let's just say this is how we're taught to look at the system right now, where when you have commercial banks engaging in, let's just say, transactions, whether they're loans, whether they're swaps, or whatever, right, with other banks, ultimately what they will do is they will say that, listen, if we give a loan to another bank, we enter into a correspondent relationship with another bank, or if we, do some sort of other exotic transaction, whatever, right, we're theoretically owed money back or dollars back or whatever back at some future point in time. So we're going to consider that an asset. But at the same time, because in order to get that asset, we also had to put ourselves out. And so then they will also record a corresponding liability on the credit side of the balance sheet. You still with me, Josh?
Yeah, but I would say that's not what we're taught, because almost nobody in the world understands kind of how the bank's balance sheet actually works and what constrains them. Because you're saying that confidence is what constrains the banking system, absolutely, but by no means is that consensus view. A lot of people today think there's bank reserves that restrain it, or physical dollars that restrain it, but in reality, there's no restraint.
Yeah, so I would agree and disagree with that. I would say if a bank's using the Fed, or let's say some sort of swap line, which ultimately is going back to the Fed, that's the it's a surrogate for confidence or whatever, right? Because what'll happen
I agree with what you're saying, that it's just strictly confidence-based system right now, which is even more imaginary than the imaginary system that we had on top of that.
Yeah. So in any event, if this is the case, then that also means that if the if you have an impairment of the asset, and when I say asset, I mean asset in quotes or whatever, right? If that blows up or burns up or whatever, right, you now have this question mark. And so that all of a sudden means that, well, wait a minute, we now have something on the liability side of the balance sheet, but we don't have a corresponding asset, on the asset side of the balance sheet. And the reason it can blow up is because, again, the silver coin can't really catch on fire or whatever, right? But if you, let's say, have something that you think is as good as a silver coin, let's say like a mortgage-backed security circa 2008, and suddenly it's no longer good, you've got a problem. But this is why I say philosophically we're treating it wrongly, because the only thing something can be in the gold side of the balance sheet, the left-hand side of the balance sheet, is that if it can't fail, in the sense that it's no one else's liability or whatever, right? So I think the actual way you want to look at this is that rather than treat a loan that's made by the commercial banks into whatever, rather than treating it as an asset for the lender perspective, I actually think you would treat it as a contra liability account, because this way you're able to still keep things in balance, but you're only dealing with the credit side of, or you're only dealing with the right-hand side, the credit side of the balance sheet. And one of the things that I found too is that when you look at a bank's balance sheet versus or when you look at a banking entity's balance sheet versus a non-banking entity's balance sheet, everything is reversed in a sense, or it's backwards, or it's the opposite of everything. So just like when you or I buy a home or whatever, right? We'll take let me see if I can do this right. So it would be like taking some cash and turning it into another asset. You're just staying on one side of the balance sheet. Well, I think banks can do the same thing, but from the bank's perspective, it would be staying on the credit side or on the right-hand side of the balance sheet for that regard. But see, this then asks, if this is correct, then that also means that, okay, well, listen, who or what is the real world asset, the counterparty to balance this intangible stuff? And this is, I think, where people run into so many problems, right? Or not problems, but this is why it's so hard to, describe and figure out the ins and the outs of this stuff. So you could say, well, maybe it's, treasuries or dollars, or somehow it could be, the argument could be made it's the U.S. government. I disagree with that argument, but for the time being, I think that people are willing to accept it. And whether there's intermediary, as the Fed, foreign central banks in the interim, the point is it's the U.S. government behind the scenes. And there's there's your surrogate for confidence, oil, gold. You could also look at that. But here's the other thing too, Josh. I would also note that when you look at what's going on right now with the system, like oil is a good example of this. They keep taking collateral out of the system. Think about the OPEC cuts or whatever, right? You could also make the concept with gold that if you keep suppressing the price of gold, or no, I should say it like that. If you make gold appear to be more plentiful than it really is by keeping the price low or whatever, right? That can also kind of distort the perception of this. So anyways, that's pretty much all I've got from the slides right here. But that's kind of what I wanted to throw out, is that I think, and this was a kind of like an aha moment I had today, is that when I think about what constrains the banking system or lack thereof, the fact that there's nothing related to the real world, there's no real assets, there's nothing on, the yellow side of the balance sheet, because there's nothing there, because the thing has been severed, that also means that you want to, at least conceptually the way we should try to treat it, is that any loan that a bank makes shouldn't necessarily be thought of as an asset from big picture wise, but rather as a contra liability. But it also leaves open the question, okay, well then what the hell is the asset in the system? And I mean, I can tell you, and that's what I don't have an answer to. So anyways, I will shut up. And Josh, why don't you let me know what you think about all that?
Yeah. And we're talking not this is more from a philosophical standpoint. In the way that the banking system works, the assets would be the loans and the treasuries and all these things that are just, they're not real wealth. And if nothing is backed by any sort of constraint, then
real world
constraint. Even if you had physical dollars, that would be a real world constraint, because I guess you can print them, but it would still be a constraint on the banking system. Right now, the only constraint is typing digits onto a computer screen. Like cash is an actual, it's not a great constraint, but it's a better constraint than what we have right now. There is not a single constraint. And the reason is a bank can make its own liabilities. Their liabilities are dollars, and they can also make its own assets. That is collateral in forms of treasuries. And the way that they could do this is they can do, they can go in the repo market, exchange their liabilities for assets, which they would exchange dollars for, let's say, treasuries, and then they prop up their asset side. They can also do a reverse repo to exchange their collateral or treasuries for dollars. So if they ever needed to, for any circumstance, these banks, they can engineer it so they can prop up their assets or their liabilities. So therefore, there's no constraint. And when you come to that conclusion, so if there's no constraint on the banking system, can't they just create all the loans as they want. Well, that's not the case because we see that banks aren't loaning. So what is that constraint? And the constraint is the other banks have to all be willing and able to accept the new liabilities that come onto those non-bank entities when they are flushing around the system. Therefore, it's strictly confidence. Because if all banks were happy and willing to take on all those liabilities, all banks could make a ton of loans, they could make a ton of money, and all would be well. But we don't see that happening. And that one second, Justin. That kind of goes on to your contra liability. So where this could be some sort of evidence that there is no incentive for the bank to make a loan because it is seen as more of a liability on their balance sheet, or they know that they have no benefit for making a loan. So all they want to do is the financial engineering to get their money so they can buy the extra yacht or whatever.
Yeah. And what I would say this too is like, I think confidence is a genuine coin of the realm, but see, it's the coin of the realm on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. It's the coin of the realm on like, up in here or whatever, right? It's got to be butted up against something else. This is where the tangibility comes. And this is where I'll use gold as the example, but I mean, there could be others, that fulfill the role. It's that like, if a bank, back in the old, let's say go back to the era of free banking or whatever, right? Let's say that a bank suddenly was called into question. Well, fine. We will honor deposits in gold. We will show you the vault or whatever, right? And sooner or later people will say, okay, well, wait a minute. I didn't have confidence before, but I cashed out some of my, bank deposits for gold, and I've seen other people have. So all of a sudden, now my confidence was lost, but my confidence is being restored because I know that there's a physical constraint in the amount of gold in the world. There's a physical restraint in the amount of gold the bank has, and the bank's been able to honor all redemptions or whatever, right? So we're good. And so this is why I would say gold is almost like this like metal golem that just kind of stands there, and pushes and stops, or because the physical gold in this case is no one else's liability. That's, I think, what would inject confidence back into the system. Or that's I think maybe one of the only things that's strong enough to push back. Even like dollars. See, here's the thing, right? Dollars will work if people continue to trust the U.S. government, but the U.S. government suddenly defaults, you're back at square one. Now, of course, if the U.S. government defaults or is seen as a risk of defaulting, we will probably have other issues to worry about than the esoteric nature of the banking system and philosophical questions relating to accounting concepts. But my point, though, is that that's kind of how I think about it. And this is one of those big concerns. And this is one of the reasons I think we struggle so hard to define it, is because no. They're not really creating assets, even though they say they're creating assets. They're creating from a philosophical standpoint. They're creating contra liabilities. And there's no corresponding asset to go with it, or the corresponding asset base that goes with it. Even if that stays the same, more and more and more liabilities and contra liabilities, even though that side is being balanced, are being leveraged up against a
So the imaginary realm, which is the financial system that we see today, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, whereas the real wealth, which is goods and services, are not increasing. So when you have this massive delta of real wealth, which is all the goods and services that we have access to, and then the financial system, which is just imaginary, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You have no check mechanism there. And then what does that do? Because we see all the financial guys having these massive yachts and being extremely wealthy because they've made these dollars, which mean nothing. It's just a massive shift of what is wealth. And kind of parlaying that onto the banking system. This video probably didn't make any sense because we just did it live, and this is more so just so we can have a better understanding of what's going on. And I'm sure that it makes no sense to you guys, but I wouldn't really worry about it. These are extraordinarily esoteric stuff, and we're not explaining it greatly.
Yeah, and I'm doing my best to try to show this. Like, if you can see this, what's going. Actually, give me just a second, Josh. Here's what's going on, right? The left-hand side of that gold or whatever, right, is what underwrites the confidence for the blue. And right now, and maybe it happened in 71, maybe it happened even further than that, these realms have become disconnected, they've become severed. And because they've become severed, this is what allowed, think back to Gammon's, example talking about the balloon, being backwards or whatever, right? This is, the point that I'm trying to make is that there's an accounting concept that lets you grow or manipulate one side of the balance sheet without touching the other, and that's the contra account. And I think that if you think about when banks make loans conceptually as not necessarily creating assets, but creating, or essentially when banks create checkbook money, when banks create M2, they're just dealing with They're just dealing with the credit side. They're dealing with the tangible side of the balance sheet, and they're not touching any of the asset side of the balance sheet. And so this gets back to the prior point. Nothing constrains banks except whatever banks can get away with, and whatever banks can get away with is what's not going to distort confidence. When things are growing and expanding, times are good. But this is what Manor says: if they ever can't be prevented from issuing $1 the entire system falls down upon itself. Or perhaps maybe say there's not enough collateral in the system. Whatever collateral that is there is being withdrawn. Again, think oil cuts or whatever, right, from the system. In order to do that. So I guess, I mean, like, I guess the question I would ask is, are they trying to engineer a collapse? Because it sure does look like it. I can't think of a better way to do it, but no, that's just my take. So anyways.
Yeah, do you have anything else to add for it? I mean, this is a very, very complex subject. And let's say you're trying to parlay what you know about the current financial system, but then everything wrong with what we've been doing for the past 20 to 30 years to get where we are today. Because it's great when times are good, everyone has more money because the imaginary side of the balance sheet, which is just the financial system, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it seems fantastic for everybody. But as Justin was saying, that from a philosophical point of view, this can only get so big because we don't have any goods to support it.
Or the way I would say was like, imagine like you're riding a bike or whatever, right? And as long as you're going, like, and your bike is utter shit or whatever, right? It's so bad or whatever, right? And if you try to stop, you're going to fall off. It's going to be really bad. Skin your knees. But as long as you keep going faster and faster and faster, you're somehow able to like maintain your balance. And so this is where you get to this thing where like, as long as the system is expanding, you're able to, it's like the story of Europe from 2008, or excuse me, from 91 to 2008, you know, as long as times are good or whatever, right? As long as people are happy, you never have to answer like, you know, the deep philosophical question. You never have to come to Jesus moment. But when you do finally have to have it, as you will eventually finally have to have it, this is where you need something that's, because people will cry out for a restoration of confidence. Historically, you know, metals have been, gold's been that, I mean, hat tipped to silver, of course, but gold's always been that in the past. Going forward, you know, I suspect gold will be part of the equation, something in the commodities realm, but this is about to veer off into geopolitics, and that's not the topic of this video. My point is just, you know, from an accounting standpoint, contra liability accounts, I think, are the way to look at how banks create money in, or checkbook money, or I guess M2, as I think I would say that. That's all.
Yeah. So what is it that nobody understands about the banking system? It is that we're completely severing the reality between the real world and the imaginary world, or the financial realm. And the financial realm keeps on getting bigger when the real world isn't. And that is going to pose massive problems at some point. Right now, it's all fine. But as Justin says, we can only keep on going in this straight line as fast as possible on a bike. And I don't know about you. I don't think we have a helmet or shin pads on. We're just going as fast as possible until our chain snaps and we just face plant.
Yeah, I would say maybe we're wearing a thong, if that, and even then, like, probably not. Anyways, I guess.
Well, we're probably wearing the same swimsuit that Klaus Schwab wore.
Oh, yeah. No, draw a veil. No, the last thing I would say too is, like, if I could only say like one other thing from the video, it's that philosophically, thou shall not treat. How can I say this? If thou shall put anything on the asset side of the balance sheet, that thing cannot be someone else's liability at the same time. Full stop. You know. The first rule of accounting is assets equals liabilities plus owner equities, and the second rule of accounting philosophically is that if something's going to go on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, it cannot be someone else's liability. So.
Yep, shitty video, guys. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one. I do want to talk about Bill Gates, so maybe stay tuned for that.